Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the sixth webinar of the Engaged Community Series, a joint initiative by the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, or SAAPRI, and the South Asian American Justice Collaborative, or SAAJCO. My name is Sufyan Sohel, and I'm proud to be moderating today's panel. For those unfamiliar with the organizing partners, SAAPRI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization established in 2001. Through community-based research and strategic partnerships, SAAPRI drives impactful policy change at local, regional, and national levels. It is dedicated to empowering South Asian Americans by advancing data equity and ensuring our communities are accurately represented in public policy. SAAJCO is a civil rights and legal services nonprofit committed to advancing the civil and human rights of the South Asian diaspora in the United States through direct legal services, community engagement, and impact litigation. We'd also love to appreciate and extend our gratitude to the Saba Foundation in Diaspora in Saba and North America for their generous support of this series. The Engaged Community Series is designated to create space for South Asians and allies to access knowledge, exchange ideas, and connect with resources that support justice and equity. Each month, we've explored one of three core and interrelated themes: Know Your Rights, Unpacking Hate, and Civic Participation in Democracy, which through conversations with expert speakers, advocates, and community leaders, we hope to empower our communities and get them as much information as possible. We're always looking for feedback, so please in the chat or send us an email about how we can improve our programs. Before we dive in, though, a quick note that this session is being recorded and will be available afterward on both SAAPRI and SAAJCO's platforms. So please feel free also to share your questions using the Q&A function or chat, and we'll get to as many as we can during or after the discussion. Tonight's panel, Amplifying Community Voices, the Stories Behind the Headlines, is about more than just a news cycle. It's about who gets heard, who gets silenced, and what's at stake when entire communities are rendered invisible. We're gathered at a painful moment. Just today, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the White House and masked federal agents can racially profile Los Angeles with no due process, snatch them off the street with no evidence or warrant, and take them away with no explanation. A lot of what we're going to talk about is how our rights may be taken away, but sometimes the news does not acknowledge it or talk about it. What are the stories being told of those experiencing hate? Earlier last month, 70-year-old Harpal Singh was brutally attacked on his morning walk near a Los Angeles Gurdwara. Surveillance footage showed him struck with a golf club, leaving him with a fractured skull and brain bleeding. Community groups have called for a thorough investigation and for this to be classified as a hate crime. September 3rd, a judge ultimately charged the defendant with attempted murder, assault with force likely to cause great bodily harm, and aggravated battery. While the DA's office maintains that there is not enough evidence to charge the defendant with a hate crime at this time, they have signaled that their willingness to add a hate crime charge only if new evidence surfaces, including from a comprehensive and well-translated interview with Harpalji as soon as he is medically able to speak and recall. These contested narratives raise our central question tonight. Who decides what is hate, what is crime, and what gets counted as violence? What determines which stories are amplified, how they're told, and which ones never make it past the margins? I'm about to stop talking, so thank you for bearing with me, because we're so fortunate to have two awesome, amazing panelists who have dedicated their lives to precisely these questions. We have Sunita Sohrabji, who's the health editor at American Community Media, where she has reported for decades on the intersection of immigration, race, health, and inequality in South Asian American communities. Her work doesn't just inform, it holds institutions accountable and ensures our stories are told with accuracy and humanity. Pradeep Singh Kaleka is a trauma therapist, educator, and advocate whose journey into this work began after he lost his father in the 2012 white supremacist attack on the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin. As co-founder of Serve to Unite and co-director of Not in Our Town, he has spent more than a decade building movements of healing, resilience, and solidarity across communities. Thank you both so much for joining us. Together, they both bring the perspectives of both journalism, advocacy, lived experience, professional expertise. And together, we're going to explore how stories shape our reality, how invisibility itself can be violence, and how amplifying this truth can be an act for justice. But before we begin with our conversation, I want to share a couple-minute clip from a video made by Not in Our Town following the 2012 white supremacist attack on the Oak Creek Sikh Gurdwara.
One of the things that was most important, I believe, for the Sikh community to hear was the clear articulation.
Well, Sufyan, I don't know if we got sound.
We do not.
And the first person that's speaking is the Eastern District, Wisconsin U.S. Attorney, former U.S. Attorney James Santel, who is articulating that this attack in 2012 at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, so the Gurdwara, would be counted as a hate crime. And so that wasn't done right away, but he was the one who was really ushering in that this was a clear hate crime.
You are muted.
Oh, no, I think are we going to play the video, or do you want to?
Yeah, it's not letting me share the sound. Give me one quick second.
Sure.
Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, while you kind of get that up. Yeah, so I think we'll talk a little bit about this, but even, as far as like just what happened that day, 7 people losing their lives to an affiliated white supremacist who was making no qualms that he is going into the Gurdwara to incite what was called a racial holy war in his mind. Even in 2012, this was not clearly defined as a hate crime from the onset until, again, former U.S. Attorney James Santel articulated that in the video, which will be months later.
And Pardeep, just to follow up with what you were saying, Wade Michael Page, the attacker, was a member of the Hammerskins Nation. He was a known entity to law enforcement. And this is where resources, I think, are really critical. We, as a country, have a large task force on international terrorism, but we have perhaps 5 agents, and this is information from a while ago on domestic terrorism within the FBI. So it clearly speaks to a lack of resources. We know that there are these hate groups all across our country, and we know that Hammerskins Nation was identified much before this attack, which could have completely been prevented had we devoted resources to identifying Hammerskin Nations and Wade Michael Page.
That's correct. Yep, you're exactly right on all of that, Sunita. Wade Page was a Hammerskin. The U.S. I mean, the Hammerskins are a national organization. They're known as a skinhead group to themselves, and they don't preach as much on religious violence, but more on white nationalism. The United States, they're known to be one of the most violent um, white supremacist groups. Internationally, they're known to be a bit more politically active behind particular candidates that they endorse. So there's an element internationally for the Hammerskins to be a bit more politically active and usher in their agenda, whereas in the United States, and especially in 2012, again, this is during former President Obama's second term. the summer of his second term being elected. And this activity, especially online, was very, very, very active. Wade Page, as you said, was a known threat to not only the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, but to the Anti-Defamation League, to the SPLC. He was very, very, very well monitored as a threat, and he was able to legally purchase a firearm. The firearms that he used inside the Sikh temple of Wisconsin were purchased just weeks prior. And I say that to not be political about these issues, but if we're really concerned about safety, and if the powers that be are concerned about really preventing mass casualty violence or targeted violence of any sort, these are the intersections of conversations that we need to have of who can get a firearm, what does the intersection of mental health and ideological beliefs look like, um, and then how do you usher in safety protocols? So no, thank you for that.
That's great. Unfortunately, we're having some sound issues, so we will be emailing out the video as our
Okay.
follow to all the attendees. And thank you both for carrying this while I was navigating the issue. And for the information on Oak Creek and how he was able to acquire firearms. And I think hearing about that and Harpal Singh and so many other cases that involve attacks against our communities, raises a number of questions, some of that you've already talked about. And Sunita, I want to start with you of how do journalists navigate the tensions of interpreting and reporting data that police label as non-hate crimes? Someone in the chat asked what designates someone or a crime to be labeled as a hate crime, and what are the implications in the legal system for recording that? And why is it such a challenge sometimes to get things reported that way?
Yeah, so this is a very good question that you asked, Sufyan. It is an extreme challenge to get something identified as a hate crime. I'll give you an example of something that I just worked on last year. At American Community Media, we were involved in a 3-year project with the state of California called Stop the Hate. And it was an initiative to amplify hate crimes and to report hate crimes in our community. And there were 30 other news organizations that worked with us on this project. A young Thai woman in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco was working after hours at a bar, and 2 women came into the bar and wanted to order drinks after hours. Well, she couldn't serve them. Mace was involved. There was an altercation, all of which was captured on CCTV in the bar. When I called police about the incident, she had not called. She was afraid for not only herself, because the perpetrators lived in the neighborhood, but also her son. I called on her behalf. I called police. Then I went on and called the DA. And despite the evidence, I sent the videotape that I had over to the DA's office. This was still not identified as a hate crime. The perpetrators got off with a slap on the wrist. They got what's called a diversionary sentence, despite the fact that this woman had burns all through her arms and all through her face from the mace that she was attacked with. So clearly a case that should have been a hate crime, but was not identified as such. And clearly a case that in which the perpetrators did basically get a slap on the wrist. And there are so many similar incidents in which there is evidence to show what happened. There was another case in my city in which a man who just went to the Taco Bell to pick up an order for himself and his son was attacked, not physically, but with a lot of violent rhetoric. And again, there was somebody who videotaped the entire incident. It was not charged as a hate crime. I called the chief of police. I called he was our vice mayor at the time, Raj Salwan. to get eyeballs on this case, and eventually it did get the perpetrator was arrested. However, he as well got a diversionary sentence. It was never charged as a hate crime. I just want to throw some data here. In 2022, there were 2,100 hate crimes reported in California by law enforcement. Only 52 actually resulted in hate crime convictions, and the majority of those took a plea deal. 6 went to trial in 2022, and just 5 went to trial in 2023, despite the fact that so many were reported. And this is when law enforcement is reporting these hate crimes. So the challenge is not only in reporting, but also in prosecuting and then eventually getting a sentence for a hate crime, which can add 2 to 5 years to a sentence.
And I think also let perpetrators know that, we are watching, that if you're doing things, especially if you're doing a crime, that's one thing, but if it's based off of bias, that's an extra layer that you're going to be further prosecuted for. I remember I used to work at CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, and we get about 200 cases reported on an annual basis. But that wouldn't translate to an increase in the FBI statistics of anti-Muslim hate, right? There'd be such a big disconnect. And I appreciate you sharing more background of the why sometimes things don't get reported or recorded as hate crimes as well.
Can I just bring up one point?
Absolutely.
So also as a former, I was a former police officer in the city of Milwaukee, and I think the other part of that is not only the prosecution or the sort of the invisibility of some of these communities, the underrepresentation, the lack of advocacy or lack of advocates, but there's also an investigation component with hate crimes when at the onset you kind of leave it to the discretion of an investigating officer if it's not a clear, like kind of like, oh my, this is for us 2012, and this is something that I don't want to get lost, and this was my fear, that ours was clearly outright a hate crime. There are so many of these crimes, which robbery, vandalism, that speak to the community at large and cause trauma to those communities at large, but then are not quite investigated as a hate crime. And so it becomes that, and this is for, I think we understand this now, that sometimes to understand racism, xenophobia, hatred from the skin of somebody else outside of you, right? It becomes that to them, it's a lived experience. But then if they're not in the same culture, sometimes it becomes an intellectual exercise. And hopefully it becomes an exercise of empathy, but that doesn't always translate. So especially when we're dealing with sort of legal language of what a hate crime is, what a hate crime enhancer is. And I think that's some of the difficulties that we're seeing, is that those that are investigating, those that are responding, those that are public officials who are speaking on those topics, to them, because just the society is the way that society is. To them, it's more of an academic experience rather than a lived experience. And so the intimacy of hate gets lost on them. And then it becomes, well, if you didn't initially investigate it as that, do you have the evidence for that? Do you have the proof? Does this person have rhetoric at home that was, yes, maybe he does have or she does have a mental illness. Maybe this person does have other confounding sort of factors that cause that, but do they also have an ideological motivation as well?
Right.
And sometimes that's not quite investigated enough.
I
I
agree.
appreciate that. Pradeep, to continue that thought a little bit, from your own experiences, what are the dangers of prematurely dismissing the possibility of bias? And then how do these decisions affect survivor trust, intracommunal safety, and the narrative around hate violence in our communities?
I think Sunita and I will probably agree on this, and you'll probably agree on this. And I think that, public safety um, is built at the speed of trust, relationships, and trust. And whether you are acting as a police officer, as an advocate, as anyone that may be a concerned parent or a loved one, or you want to build relationships of trust and rapport. And I think that when somebody's pain does not quite get heard, they may not be able to articulate it, but there's a dismissal of, oh, you don't you don't quite understand, you don't quite get it. And to me, there's a lot of systemic work that's in that area of, it's not quite connecting and it's not quite serving. It's there, but people are not quite accessing it, right? And this is any city in the US, I've seen this over and over, that here's a resource, here's a resource, here's a resource, here's a mental health resource, here's that resource, here's this, but yet people aren't accessing it. And people that quite frankly need those resources are not quite accessing those systems. And those, instead of asking and saying, well, are we not meeting people where they are? Right? Sometimes it becomes this whole thing of just blame, where, oh, they just don't get it, or you put them through some kind of bureaucratic process to have, for example, just a hate crime enhancer charge, right? You almost put the person on trial that, sorry, was the victim,
Mhm.
and then it becomes, you're even more disconnected. And so I think that's the danger in all of this, is that we are creating and magnifying distrust within systems that need to work together to really fulfill what this democracy can feel like.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And Pradeep, just to amplify what you were saying, I had a conversation last year with California Attorney General Rob Bonta about the challenges in actually prosecuting hate crimes and identifying hate crimes. And the proof of burden is very difficult because something has to start out as a hate incident. If I issue a slur to you in the course of a robbery, well, that's not a hate crime and it's not going to get charged as such. So I have to, from the start, say, hey, whatever I'm going to say to you, and then, do whatever else it is that I'm going to do, and then it would get charged as a hate crime. However, that burden of proof is very difficult, and so in most cases, those will not get prosecuted because the other charges against are much easier to prove,
For sure.
and there is evidence for that.
For sure. Yep.
Thank you for that. Let's shift over into storytelling. Sunita, I struggle right now watching news and reading headlines because the same story, you just look at the headlines, can be like 7 different headlines, just trying to get clicks and readers and all of that. Can you tell us about a time when a story that you covered made headlines, but you knew there was deeper truths that were missing? And how did you navigate that?
Um, Yeah, so I'll talk about one of the first cases that I ever reported as a cub reporter. And this was way back when in 1987, there was a young man in Hoboken, New Jersey. His name is Navroz Modi. And at the time, and I'm not sure a lot of your audience was born at the time, but at the time, there were a group of kids who called themselves the Dock Busters and went around town attacking Indian people. There was a fear that many Indians were now in Hoboken and New Jersey at large, and they needed to get out of there. So the Dot Busters attacked Navroz Modi as he was coming out of a bar late night in Hoboken. He fell to the ground. He did not die on the scene. He died 4 days later at a hospital. Uh, if I remember correctly, 4 of the perpetrators were juveniles and were charged as such. Got pretty I would say slap on the wrist convictions. The three others who were adults, even though they were charged with murder, got 7 years, and that was it. And at the time, we did not have language to talk about this as a hate crime. It came on the heels of the Vincent Chin murder. And again, we did not have the language to prosecute these cases as hate crimes. That came much, much later. And I see as a community now, the one thing that I feel 40 years later is that we do now have the language, and we do have an interest in amplifying these cases, and making sure that reporters understand the dynamics of what looks like a simple robbery.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Pradeep, from an advocacy side, how about a story where the public narrative felt incomplete, or that there was an untold story or part of it?
Mm. Yeah, and I've been blessed to travel around different communities in the aftermath of 2012, and just kind of what happened there in response to, and again, like speaking about some of the intersections of advocacy work that you take on, such as, I mean, we're talking about a hate crime that kind of asked America if they were ready for this multicultural society, right? I think there were certain people who put out there that we were living in a post-racial world when former President Barack Obama was elected. And I think just that narrative of putting an intention out there, and again, as nice as it was, takes a lot of work to actually institute structures, systems, and a culture of a genuine multiracial democratic society in America. And so just getting blessed to be able to visit town after town. And one of the one of the towns that I kind of remember distinctly was a town in Massachusetts, small town. And at that time, we called them the preservationists. So there was a group of preservationists and there was a group of progressives. And half the town was kind of split into two, and they sort of had an emblem, which was the sort of the at the front of the town, and then kind of was around a Bible and then other things being said on that emblem about the values that town held dear. And we got kind of the calls of, here's the preservationists who don't believe that this is inclusive. I'm sorry, here's the progressives who don't believe that this is inclusive enough, this town emblem. Here were the other folks who were like, we value our traditions. And a lot of the challenge was like, how do we get them to hear each other? How do we get them to listen to each other and have a conversation with each other? And then how do we get away from just lamenting about problems and get to a solution, right? And and that was, so I think the Sikh temple like what happened was sort of inspiration to kind of come together in a communal gathering. The other complication was this town uh, had two Hindu temples that were being built. And I thought that would kind of, like, I was like, that's kind of, it's kind of strange in a way because, and we're, Indian people, we're used to politics within the Gurdwara or the temple or the masjid and saying, oh, okay, they're not getting along, families aren't getting along, so they're going to build their own. But I was like, for a town that was like having difficulties with all of this, that was another sort of confounding like factor. And so we asked the town what was really like at the core of what was the presenting behavior to the manifest, like what was really causing that. And some people would say, well, I think that the new people haven't invested enough into what America is. And then some of the new people, are we giving them opportunities to? So it deepens some of the conversations around a problem. I said, okay, well, when is your next voting voting cycle? since voting is such a, it's a big deal to civics and the politics of America. And where do you have it? Well, next time, can we have it inside one of those manders? And they agreed, and they had it, and then said, okay, the people that are inside can meet you, you can meet them, they can be part of civic participation. And I think sometimes those stories, I would like to see more and more of those stories be told of how tension wasn't, I mean, how tension helped build community, and then, not just to the point that, I never want to put somebody in a place where their being gets so rejected that they have to keep putting themselves into those situations. But I think that's kind of where we're at right now. We can't just say, okay, you know what, I reject them and they reject us, and we just build more, weapons of mass rejection.
No, thank you for that. And part of me sometimes feel we're reverting more and more back to that, right? Where we're in a time that is becoming more divisive, and we're being isolated and based on our faiths, our race, our language, our immigration status, where we're working. I'd love to hear from you both, starting with Sunita. What role do some of those factors like cultural nuances, faith, language, immigration status play in whether stories are understood accurately?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to talk about a case in 2015 in Madison, Alabama, where uh, an elderly, I'll call him elderly, he was 57 years old. His name is Suresh Bhai Patel. He was walking around his neighborhood, taking his early morning walk, and a neighbor saw him walking. Neighbor called police because he looked suspicious, and police came. They knocked him to the ground. He could not speak English. He could not tell them that he was visiting his family in Madison. They beat him so badly. He was in the hospital for months. And I think so much of what happens, so much of what these crimes are basically just not understanding. And it's simplified, it's exemplified in a case like that where a person was not be able to defend themselves simply because they did not speak the language. And I think that that occurs so often in incidents like this. People not taking the time to actually understand what this person is doing. He was just taking his morning walk.
Mm,
Yeah.
Thank you.
yeah,
Pradeep?
I think about the and I call it the spiritual toll, but obviously from a mental health perspective and being a mental health professional, there's always this call to pathologize, right? But there really is a spiritual decline in the way that we um, kind of understand ourselves and our identity and belongingness in this country. And it's taken me a really long time to kind of grasp this and see it, not just in myself. Now I'm close to 50, but see it in my children who are, younger, and they're growing up, and they feel sort of invisible. Like, I mean, we talk about this, sort of the invisibility of not having enough role models, not having enough um, people. And I think all of us are worth so much, right? But sometimes we don't see that represented out into the world. So we don't see value in ourselves. We see value in assimilating. And a lot of times that assimilation comes uh, with us assimilating towards who we see as powerful. I will say, especially for young men. Um, and so I'm seeing lots of young men, especially 15 to 24, right? High rates of suicide, high rates of mental illness, and some of this is kind of undiagnosed of like, what is this? What really is it? Is this depression? Is this anxiety? Is this dual diagnosis with drug addiction, with alcoholism? What is this? And I would say it's a bit of a spiritual sort of loss. And the sacrifice of what we give up from the histories of who we were and where we are, I don't know if it's worth the sacrifice, because what we're assimilating to sometimes doesn't become just, we oversimplify it by saying some kind of colonial white supremacist capitalistic society. But I see a lot of young men who are assimilating into a power over model, into the sense of I need to win at any cost. I need to be bigger than you, stronger than you. I need to dominate you. And that therefore I have worth. What we understand it fundamentally is saying that's not who we are. Because faith doesn't need to dominate. Faith needs to teach us how to connect. And we lose a little bit, even if I say I'm sick, right? Even if we say I'm Hindu, I am Muslim, I am Christian. You know, we have lots of Christians in India. We have a very pluralistic society. And again, not saying India is perfect at all, but the United States and the world is going toward this model where we see value in having power over, and we lose who we are from a faith perspective. And it becomes, we lose compassion. Unless you agree with me, I don't have compassion for you.
Mhm.
We lose empathy. Unless I can really, really like get into a place where I can exercise and know I know Pardeep at an intimate level. I don't really empathize with Pardeep. So we're losing connection. We're not even losing connection with everybody else. Many people feel disconnected from themselves. Of I don't know who I am. I'm always trying to people please and assimilate that I don't know who I am. So I think the loss of all of that, right? It's one thing to just to be and kind of say that we are definitely, and I agree, we are definitely invisible. We don't have enough positions of value that we can really take on. So therefore, our children have to kind of think about it and say, "Oh, I look up to this and I look up to that," and then the sacrifice of, well, what do we lose trying to be all of that, and is it worth the sacrifice?
Well, thank you. And I appreciate everything you said, and especially on the assimilation piece. I remember growing up, my parents came in the 70s, and it was all about assimilating, fitting in, don't rock the boat, try to be as white as possible in the middle class white communities. Like my brother used to grow a beard in college, and my dad said, shave it, don't make them question you post 9/11, right? You're going to be a target. Um, and Sunita, taking some things of what you said earlier about, how stories and like the reporting and the hesitation to report. We talked a little bit about the FBI statistics, and in 2017, we saw an increase in reported hate crimes towards many of our communities. And I think it was twofold. One, yes, I think through the election cycle, we started normalizing anti-immigrant hate, and it became a lot more accepted to be mainstream hateful towards a lot of these communities. But two, I also felt and saw a change in communities feeling more empowered to share their stories.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, we come from communities where we feel that we either have really negative relationships with law enforcement agencies and lack of trust, but also feel that sometimes hate and discrimination is a rite of passage, right? That we have to do this, like just hold our head down and take it. I'd love to hear from you both of stories you've heard from survivors or families that may have never reached the public eye, and when that happened, what was the reason behind it? Was it this lack of coverage, or was it that it wasn't recognized as a hate crime, or was it that they were just afraid to report and share their stories? And Sunita, I'll start with you, please.
Yeah, so Sufyan, just to tell you a little bit about 2017 and what happened there. The FBI, for the first time, allowed the tease out of crimes against Hindus, crimes against Sikhs, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the other community, but there was another South Asian community that they teased out the data on. So now we had quantifiable data about each of our communities, whereas before we were lumped in as Asian Americans. And so you could see that in that year there were 72 hate crimes against Sikhs, as however many there were against Hindus, etc. And I think that that was a really powerful signal to our communities that, yeah, we're visible in this data. And I think you are right. I think we feel more empowered to tell our stories. And for me as a journalist, I feel um, in so many cases, I feel like I've been the front line. People who know me and know my reporting will call me when they feel that they've been the victim of a possible hate incident. And the stories that sometimes don't go reported are when I've had to tell them, well, that's not really a hate crime, right? That's hate speech, which is protected by the Constitution, right? And so you don't really have it, and it's disappointing to tell people that, but and we may still report the story, but it was not a hate crime, right? And so in a way, educating our community about what constitutes a hate crime versus hate speech, which is not a chargeable offense, and protected by the Constitution. Um, uh, uh, and also the number of stories that have come out, I think really empowers people to talk about when they feel that they've been victims. And I know there are a lot of lawyers on this call, so I just want to say this one thing. Let us have access to the people that you're representing, because their stories are just so powerful. They are, and you cannot tell their stories for them. Direct contact with the survivor is one of the most important pieces that you can provide to us. And I hope you'll consider that.
Great plug in for that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Pradeep, anything to add?
Yeah, just I mean, some of the incidents that so next week I'll be at the Eradicate Hate Summit in Pittsburgh, and over the years I've gotten to know a lot of the families who have been impacted by hate. We call ourselves kind of survivors, or survivors in action, meaning people who have taken loss and have done just incredible work with it, advocating for change, advocating for systems to understand this. Unfortunately, some of the systems and structures and funding that was dedicated towards that um, has been directed towards different initiatives now currently. And so there's hope that for these survivors that we will again reprioritize and come back to being much more preventative against these types of hate crimes or hate incidents. Or sometimes so the difference between a hate crime and a hate incident obviously is there's a crime committed on one, but there's a lot more hate incidents that go either unreported or they don't escalate to the place of a crime. Um, but we use those indicators of incidents as a way to say things are escalating in a particular community against another community, and it may turn into a hate crime, or some community may be very, very, very vulnerable and targeted because of it. With that said, as I think about the number of anti-Black hate incidents and crimes that has traditionally happened in this country, and even as we think about the relationship sometimes that we need to have as far as understanding civil rights in this country and other rights, is that sometimes communities get pinned against each other, and they say, well, your community has uh, structures or systems or some kind of infrastructure available, and that may be valid. That those are conversations that we definitely need to have. But sometimes it happens to communities where it becomes your pain doesn't matter as much as this community's pain, and we either consciously or subconsciously sometimes say it or feel it, and then there's so I mean, in 2017, there was a particular incident where it was Lieutenant Richard Collins was murdered. He was 23 years old. He was murdered in a hate crime at knife point by a hateful individual. He was, obviously just made lieutenant, military. He was waiting on the bus stop, and his mom, Dawn, his mom and dad, Dawn and Richard Collins, have created the Lieutenant Richard Collins Foundation and have done just incredible work over the years. But I've often wondered why that story has not really garnered the amount of attention that other stories garner. And I think that Patrice and I, not in our town, we spoke about this, and we're like, we want to do a segment that talks about the intersection of, or do a film, right, that talks about the intersection of hate, but also highlight their story, their advocacy. They will be there in Pittsburgh. But again, I think that one of the and again, this is a tangent where I'm going off, that I think sometimes what I wonder is that is anti-blackness so American that the amount of hate directed towards the Black community feels like just being America. It's just another day. And so it's like, okay.
I think you raise a great question there. And I think even the divisiveness you talk about and the competition of who's experiencing hate most, we see it globally, we see it locally. I see it in Chicago with when we had refugees from Venezuela and who's getting what resources for different communities, right? And what it does is then takes away from the stories of what they're experiencing. So I appreciate you amplifying that. Pradeep, I want to give you some moments to, you lost your father in the Oak Creek shooting, and what has been your healing journey and messages that you would share for the audience here with us today?
Yeah, no, Sufyan and Sunita, you both know this, as far as, you know, we um we as a community in 2012 and where we were then and where we are now, um is is always going to be just kind of, you're inspired, you're changed, you're impacted. There's mixed emotions that happen to be around grief, and there's cycles where you feel incredibly hopeful one month, and then the next month you're like, wow, this is the work that I've done, or the work that we have done, has been for naught. And I was just having this conversation with someone today who wanted to do what we call intervention work, and I kind of posed the question of, do we really have the will to do this work? Do we do we really want to prevent targeted violence or violence at all? Or has it become such a part of us that somehow, some way, we don't really want to prevent it? And so, from a person that's impacted in that way, um, there's an urgency. There's an urgency to say, I don't want anybody to be impacted by any of this, whether it happens at a school, at a religious place of worship, or at a government building, or any of that. And so, for us over the years, there's been ebbs and flows of hope, but then there's also been ebbs and flows of, we're going the wrong direction. And I think in this moment, I want to be really, really sincere in that conversation. I don't want to say, you know what, things will just be fine. And I trust that the will of good will just bend the arc towards the good, right? I want to say that there's a lot of work that we need to do, and we all need to roll up our sleeves and really, really get to work, and help this country heal. Um, Whether you think that this country has kind of been born out of the foundation of white supremacy, of a history that um, has marginalized many, many people or hurt many people. Whether you think, and I tell people that, whether you think blood is in the soil, or somebody else knows that blood is in the soil, we all need to be farmers, and we all come from farming communities. And I think that the world needs us to put our hands deep, deep into the soil of this country and really till and really just say, okay, it's going to be difficult work, but I got 4 children myself. I know that you all have loved ones, and I think the universal truth of parenthood, or even having sort of maybe you're not a parent, maybe you're uncle, maybe you're aunt, maybe you're a caretaker, maybe you have adopted children, but the universal sort of connection that we can all kind of like say is, I need the world to be better for them than the world that was for me.
Yes.
Right? We can all agree upon that. Whether you're
Yeah.
liberal, whether you're right, left, I don't, it doesn't matter. Whether you're libertarian, I don't, you can say that the world, and sometimes we can say some of the feelings that we have around the urgency of that get weaponized, and we need to really be thoughtful about the way that that goes forward. But let's start to like really do the work together. So I think for us, I'm grateful for you both, everybody that's on this call, the sponsors that put to today like to put today's broadcast together possible, is that you all have raised your hand and said, listen, we're gonna put our hands in that soil. We're going to till. Yeah, it's gonna come up dirty sometimes. It's gonna come up bloody sometimes. We're not gonna like what we see sometimes, but we love this country enough to like to go there.
Thank you so much. And so sorry for,
Pradeep, can I share? You had connected me to Lieutenant Brian Murphy, who was one of the first responders at the Oak Creek Gurdwara when this happened on August 5th, 2012. And I spoke to Lieutenant Murphy 10 years after the incident, and he'd been shot 15 times. He still has a bullet lodged in his larynx and in his head. Correct me if I'm wrong,
Yep, no,
Pradeep.
you're right.
Yeah, and
Yeah, shot 15 times from close range
yeah,
and survived.
yep, he survived. And he told me about how much that incident had changed his life. He'd often gone by the Gurdwara, but never sort of bothered to step into it and, really understand the community that he was serving. And after that day, he's been such an advocate for the Sikh American community. He he has tried, I think, in the years since, to understand the community that he served at that time. And his story is just so incredibly powerful. And uh, it should not take an act of hate for us to understand each other, but sometimes it does.
Think about
Yeah,
how many, and just to your point, Lieutenant Murphy, if Lieutenant Murphy did not respond when he responded, Wade Page would have used those 15 shots inside. But because there
absolutely.
was a window there, and Wade Page was trying to get away, this wasn't a suicide mission by any
Yeah,
means. He had the shooter in the situation had his car tactically parked to get away. So unlike many other mass casualty uh, events where suicide is the end result, that only happened because Lieutenant Murphy and the other police officers responded and engaged in a firefight with Wade Page. But to your point, the urgency of responding, the faith, the courage that it took to walk into that situation where you're taking 15 shots,
yeah,
many of them from close range, would have been many of our women. My mother survived,
right.
right? Because Lieutenant Murphy responded.
That's absolutely right.
thank you both. We have time for one very last short question. And Sunita, I will start with you. Is what can we as communities, and your choice of how you define community, do to create safer, more accessible spaces for people to share their truths and untold stories?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say definitely connect with your local ethnic media reporter, because we will tell your stories. But on a policy level, currently hate crimes reporting them to the FBI to create the UCR reports, Universal Crime Reports that we see every year. That's done on a voluntary basis by law enforcement. What I would like to see is that being mandatory so that we can actually understand what's going on in our communities, because California will report, Alabama probably will not report. And so we're seeing a huge underreporting of data, of necessary data that would add a lot to this conversation.
Thank you. Pradeep, same question, but we were also asked in the questions of the efforts that the non-Sikh community has done to continue education and outreach and to build those relationships. So I'd like you to define community, not only the South Asian or the Sikh community, but maybe broader Milwaukee, Oak Creek, Wisconsin communities. What has that effort? You've talked about steps forward, step backwards. And what can we all do to just be better with each other?
Yeah, I'm going to start by saying just again, intentionality, and whether you think this intentionality of healing, intentionality of healing, whether you think this is from America 1400, 1500, 1600 to what is now, or whether you think about it as a local community, such as Oak Creek is a perfect example of this. Oak Creek is a suburb which is right outside of the city of Milwaukee. And during 2012, you saw the changing demographic of what that feels like. And when we know that there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of tension around what is my role now in this changing demographic? And this is never to say, well, these people are wrong or those people are right. This is to kind of get away from right and wrong and say, how do we be effective, right? How do we move forward together? And so when that happened, when the Sikh temple shooting happened, there was, I mean, and then there's so many, like from the police chief to the mayor at that time to the community of that time, not understanding what hate looks like and feels like to a community. But then this this I would say just not, it wasn't just one person. You know, we had interfaith initiatives, we had religious initiatives, we had racial. I mean, you name it, and that person showed up, and they got there and they learned from it and they grew from it. And Oak Creek today is one of the most diverse suburbs in the United States. And they have a celebration each year called the Cafe event, where they bring together um, people of different cultures and they celebrate each other. And this is, largely like around, I mean, around September, October, they have this, but they're intentional in the way that they want to move forward in their healing. So I think if a local community can do that, we can all inspire our local communities to do something, to say, and maybe we don't call it, it's difficult to tell somebody that, we still suffer from the illness of dominance and power, and maybe sometimes we call it white supremacy, but that sometimes puts people into the corner of, oh, you're going against my, being. But to say, let's all heal together.
Thank you. Pradeep, Sunita, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your truths and your stories and such inspiring words for all of our attendees. We're getting some great feedback about your messages and the love that you both clearly have for the work that you're doing. And thank you. And if we can ever support you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's conversation. We hope this was insightful and engaging as part of our Engaged Community series. Before we wrap up, just a few quick notes. SAAPRI is currently conducting a live survey. We'll send it out to all attendees. Your voice is important, and I'm going to drop it into the chat as well. And we'll also be compiling notes and key takeaways. We'll share that video we weren't able to watch as well, and share it as a resource to all of attendees, as well as be available on the SAAPRI and SAAJCO websites. And our next panel coming up on October 9th at 6 p.m. will be Breaking the Silence, Domestic Violence and Immigrant Rights. And you can register using the Eventbrite link that I am dropping in here as well. Thank you all. Thank you again to our guests tonight, and we hope to see you all next month.